Someone had asked the question why Keynesianism results in that of corporatism, and as I've mentioned many times before, when you talk about that of the mixed economy, you cannot avoid corporatism. It's just how things are set up. Typically what Keynesians believe in, they believe in trying to control the market because they're against the belief of the free market. They think that the free market's the reason for why you face the Great Depression, the banking crisis, even although it's the complete opposite of the truth. You would say that they are quasi-socialists. In other words, they're not full-blown socialists. They don't favour, Marxism. They're against that. But they do believe in this strong mixture between the public and private sector. Now, through the use of government, the government then takes control over the economy to some degree. Through the government, it gets to pick and choose winners and losers. There's no such thing as a perfect system. So perfection doesn't exist. You're never going to have something of perfection. And I'm, an anarchist at heart and minarchist by mind. It requires the government's interference in the market in order to lead on the road for corporatism to thrive. The issue being is the fact that when you've got a competitive market and you've got competition in the marketplace, you're always going to find a specific group who want to take advantage, who basically want to use it for their own advantage to beat out their competition, and they will use the government to do so. That's why there's no such thing as a perfect system. And I suppose that's the very reason for why anarchists themselves make the argument that they do, that you need to just eliminate government completely for this very reason. It's the reason why you need to separate the state from the economy. When you have a mixed economy, you're giving some level of control and you're depending upon the state. The state has the power to tax you, etc. But the more and more you depend upon the state, the more it becomes corrupted. What ends up happening is government ends up picking and choosing the winners as those who benefit them the most. It happens to be those with the most money, who can pay them off, who can lobby them. So what you end up finding is this economic fascist system, this corporatist system, where those of special interest groups will always seek to take advantage of the situation. Competition is always going to seek to eliminate their competition. When you bring in the government intervention, what ends up happening is the opposite. Contrary to their popular belief, they think that government regulation protects them from all of these monopolies and oligopolies and cartels, etc. But nothing could be farther from the truth. It's actually through government's intervention that enables these things to thrive. You saw that with the De Beers Group. You've seen that with many other examples. The Sherman Antitrust Act wasn't there to break up supposed monopolies. It was there for the sake of the McKinley Tariff. It was protectionist at its root. Eventually, things like the American Medical Association, monopoly, etc., all of these things sprung up. You've seen the cartelization as well with the private pharmaceutical companies, etc., through government's intervention. Again, that was through the third-party payer system that government had imposed. So it's through government's interference that ends up creating these things, because when government steps in with regulation, it's laying down barriers to entry into the market. It ends up giving favours to one group over the other, whether it does so intentionally or unintentionally. You could take as an example with the protectionist tariffs. The protectionist tariffs may end up giving special interest favours to one group of businesses, and it may harm another group of businesses. Through the consequences of what happens, it ends up giving benefit to a special interest group over other types of businesses. And typically in this corporatist system, the heavier government regulation typically benefits those who can afford it, those who are the giant corporations, etc., rather than the small business people. Again, you could see that within the American healthcare system, where many small hospitals could not afford to survive because of the heavier government regulation. You only have to give the government a sniff of the economy. The government grows and grows. There's more and more interference in the market. There's more regulation and control over the private sector. The more and more government regulation there is, the more barriers it sets down, where you find special interest groups and the government subsidies. So this all relates to what you saw of the 1930s, especially in the United States of America. Again, you could see that through the protectionist roots from the likes of FDR, protecting those of the special interest groups such as the farmers, etc, etc. And although through whether you claim to be good intentions, all in the name of protecting them from job losses, actually resulted in larger job losses over a period of time, especially when you saw the Roosevelt recession in 1938. There was more than 10 million unemployed in 1938, I'm sure it was, over and above the 8 million that was unemployed in 1931, and that should really tell you everything there is to know about that. Because under capitalism, you've got the competition, they're always competing against one another. As soon as you get the government involved in the economy, then of course it gives these special interest groups, etc., the political entrepreneurs, gives them an incentive and the ability to do so, to lobby these politicians to get them to lay on more government regulations to stamp out competition, etc. And it becomes a rat race almost. You end up seeing more and more government regulation. And before you know it, the small business people cannot afford to compete. There's no way for them to compete against these giant corporations, etc. It's impossible. Now, you've seen this with the 2008 financial crisis. It wasn't just a case that you had these lending institutions who were to blame. You could also blame the central banking system. Take the United States of America, for example. Again, the Federal Reserve is to blame. The United States government's to blame. After all, it's the United States government that granted, the Federal Reserve a monopoly over the nation's monetary supply. That's why the Federal Reserve got to the position that it did, because of the United States government. You would see the Federal Reserve fixing interest rates below market value. Like I've said before, the higher interest rate is a signal to the market saying there's a shortage of savings. Tom Woods touched upon a fantastic point, and he explains how artificially reducing the interest rates had resulted in a shortage. So there's a shortage of basically resources, etc. So for these long-term projects they're taking on for investment, they can't finish them because the fact that there's a shortage of resources and whatnot. And artificially lowering the interest rates sends out the wrong signals to these investors, and it sends out wrong signals to these first-time buyers, etc. So you end up seeing a large increase in demand from consumers rushing out basically to borrow in such a period when really they should be saving. The market value at that time would be a high interest rate that serves that purpose so that they can save. When you lower that interest rate, it's causing them to rush out and borrow and spend in a period when there's shortages. Lending institutions would then take advantage of that. Ryan Dawson brilliantly touches upon this in his chapter on the housing bubble. The lending institutions would take advantage of this, where because of what the Federal Reserve had did in lowering the interest rates, they were now able to lower their own rates as well, of course, lend out large amounts of these mortgage loans to subprime buyers, or shall I say subprime borrowers. And these subprime borrowers would be the type of people who wouldn't be able to pay back or anything like that. They would be in debt, and all that would happen is they would lend out all these large loans, mortgage loans to them, and they were getting away with this fraudulent behaviour because of government protectionism. Again, it's all to do with that Keynesianism, all the good intentions from Keynesians. The problem, for example, of the central bank being able to artificially lower interest rates because governments granted them such a monopoly, as well, of course, fixing the ratio, which they fixed it at 1 to 33 in the United States. It resulted in large scale, lending, and they were getting away with this fraudulent behaviour where these people would take on these risky mortgages, then the lending institutions would sell them off to these investment banks. The investment banks, the likes of the Lehman Brothers and Goldman Sachs, etc., would then bundle it all together in these complex derivatives, and then they would basically pay off the rating agencies and get them to rate these bundled together risky mortgage loans, the complex derivatives. They would get them to rate them with AAA ratings, and then they would sell them off to that of investors. So investors were ending up with basically risky mortgage loans that they didn't even know. The reason why these investment banks were getting away with that, because they knew that if everything collapsed, there was always going to be government there to step in and protect them, because the taxpayer is forced to bail them out. That's why this whole system today is problematic, because Keynesians, through their good intentions, has got government involved. The Keynesians were the ones arguing in favour of the bailouts. Well, actually, it was because of government itself that's a problem, because the government is taking away the risk. Because you've got to remember, if you are a private lender in a capitalist system, you face a risk that who you lend out to, you might not make a return. So in a capitalist system, you face the threat of a loss. That borrower might default, so you lose the money that you ended up lending out. So you're more cautious in a capitalist system, because you're not going to just lend to anybody. You would only lend to those you can trust, that you know are be able to pay back. But that is not what happened with everything in the lead up to the 2008 financial crisis. And because of government's protectionism, which is another part of it, these investment banks, etc., they knew that regardless of their fraudulent behaviour, they didn't need to worry about anything. Even if they were to, the entire system was to collapse, they were going to, win from it, because they don't pay for their loan losses. That's what it means by capitalising the gains and socialising the losses. And I've touched upon this before, of privatising the gains and socialising the losses, or they call it capitalism for the poor and socialism for the rich, and many people misinterpret what that means. It doesn't mean capitalism is making poor people poorer. It doesn't mean socialism is making rich people richer. It's capitalism for the poor because people are paying for it. But what's not capitalism is forcing people to pay, is forcing people to subsidise. That element there, that coercion, is socialism, because subsidies are socialist. You're socialising the losses. So the government is forcing people to basically pay for the losses of others, when it should never be the case. It should be down to a capitalist system where you leave things liquidate, and at the end of the day, if you can't pay for your losses, then tough. At the end of the day, that's your own fault. The whole point of the capitalist system is to reward success and punish failure. What capitalism basically enables is efficiency in this regard. In terms of private lenders, they're only going to lend to those they can trust that will be able to pay them back. And because of this protectionist system, because of Keynesianism and all the protectionism from government, you now have a system where the rights of individuals have all been subordinated, and you've been forced into a collective group in some level of collectivism, in other words socialism, where your rights and your liberties have been taken away from you, and you've been forced collectively to pay for the losses of others. That has taken away the risk of the creditors. Now, the private lending institutions, how they got rid of the risk was they simply just sold off those risky mortgage loans that they created, and sold them off to the investment banks, because at the end of the day, okay, it's no longer their responsibility because they've just sold them off there. But the investment banks, they knew that they could get away with doing whatever they liked. They're not going to face any losses. When the entire system collapses, they gain from it, because the government is there to protect them from the losses. They're bailing them out. They would never have got away with that if they were under a capitalist system. And the reason why they would never have been able to get away with that fraudulent behaviour, they would be faced with the risk that who they lend out to, they might not be able to pay them back. When they fix the ratio at 1 to 33, because it's at 1 to 33, they can lend out a large amount, a crazy amount of these loans to cheap credit to these type of subprime borrowers who would never be able to pay back. This corporatist system of socialising losses and privatising gains has been able to take place because of government's interference. When you remove the government from the economy and you reduce and limit government of its power, they wouldn't be able to get away with this type of fraudulent behaviour. You can't expect something of perfection with regards to capitalism. For those who are critics, what's their suggestion? Because the mixed economy is not the suggestion, it's the very reason why corporatism thrives. You can't have a mixed economy without corporatism is impossible. You know, that's the very reason why you see these problems today. And the Scandinavian countries are nothing at all like the utopias they make out to be. They're unsustainable. You're faced with all the oligopolies, the monopolies, the cartelisation. So then what's a viable solution? Is socialism a viable solution? In terms of full-blown socialism, you would lead to economic catastrophe like you see in the likes of Venezuela. So then what is the viable solution? Whilst capitalism isn't perfect, it's the only system that can prevent these monopolies from occurring, and the only system that can prevent the oligopolies from occurring. And whenever cartelisation tries to take place, competition is incentivized to jump in and destroy it because of how profitable the industry is. It basically requires government's interference in order for these cartels to hold place, to maintain. You find government and, of course, the corporations in bed together. The very reason why that was enabled to take place was the very natural state of the whole mixed economy. Another thing you could look at in this argument is the fact that through the mixed economy, more and more people become dependent upon the state. Now, throughout recorded history, you've seen how self-serving governments have been. I even drew the comparison of what Thomas J. De Lorenzo had excellently pointed out in his illustration between private turnpike industry between 1794 to 1845, and then contrasting that to when Abraham Lincoln stepped in, and you would see, of course, how self-serving governments were. I'm not painting such a system to say, oh look, capitalism's perfect. I'm not saying to you that you'll ever get rid of corruption 100%. I'm not saying to you that you would ever get rid of exploitation 100%. That's not what I'm saying. There's no such thing as that. To believe in such perfection is just non-existent, and it would be lying to people. That's what socialists do. Socialists paint you a narrative that just is non-existent. It's just deluded, to be perfectly honest with you. All I'm saying to you is a real world solution to basically prevent that problem is to limit and reduce the size and power of the state, to separate it from the economy. That way you reduce the state, hold it accountable, and prevent the state from interfering. You leave these companies to act in the free market, and that means, you know, whether it's the private banks, these lenders, etc., they can't just get away with doing what they're doing. They've got risk involved, the losses that they potentially face. They can't get away with doing what they do without using the government. And if you say, well, that's just the natural state of how things are, that's not an argument, because then you're going down the road of the mixed economy that is essentially and precisely why you've got this system today. And government will always go where the money is. Governments are easily corruptible, and it just so happens to be that the larger government grows, the more and more corrupt it becomes, and it infringes upon people's rights and their liberty, and you end up seeing a very problem in the economy. Just look at the debt problem, the deficit problem, you know, all of these things. I hope that really clears from that perspective that you're never going to have this whole thing to do with a mixed economy and Keynesianism without corporatism, because it's protectionist at its root. It's impossible to basically have a system where you've got competition in the private sector. And it's like I said, I mean, the more government interferes, it ends up destroying competition and gives rise to these monopolies, etc. Now, that's just the natural state of how things are, and that's why I respect the argument that anarchists make. I suppose the very reason why I'm not an anarchist is because I just feel sad that I don't think this world is ever going to accept that. I don't think people ever will. Difficult enough as it is to get people to even see that the free market's the solution to the current problems. If you've got any questions that you would like to ask me on anything, then of course feel free to comment in the comment section below. Anything that you've got I might have missed out, you know, comment in the comment section, and of course I'll be grateful for it. You're not going to fix this problem through a mixed economy. Government does not protect you from the monopolies, oligopolies and cartels. It's actually the result of why you've got them. So again, thank you for watching, and I shall talk to you later. Cheers.